Welcome to Grace Excels Bible Study. This study is a little different than most. It doesn't focus on a teacher before an audience, but rather it focuses on the text taken here from lumina.bible.org. That text is then highlighted, copied and pasted to a Word document, and then we'll study it in its structural analysis. The intent of this particular study is to demonstrate that through the use of a word processor, the student of the particular scripture can rearrange the passage around its structure and analyze it for spiritual benefit. Believing that every word is inspired, believing that the author had an intention, inspired by the Holy Spirit, to communicate a message to the audience, believe that we can get further insight if we study carefully and just observe what the text has, and then make that the focus as we begin the study. So taking the first 18 verses of John's Gospel, I will copy these verses with a left button click of the mouse, right button to copy it, and then a Control tab to switch over to a Word document. In this case, I'm using Microsoft Word for the iMac. I'll paste the document using Control V, and after a short pause, and I've got it illustrated up to 200% so you can see the text, I'll scroll back and forth. I want to honor the chapter and verse notations, but I don't want to hold on to the titles that the New American Standard editors have used. Although helpful, I want to be able to study these passages without the titles that are there. I may end up in the same place, but right now I just want to eliminate all the titles, make some small editorials from the transfer, and have the text in place. You'll note that the passages have been aligned around paragraphs. 1 through 5 is a paragraph, then 1:6 through 8 is another paragraph, 9 through 13 a third, and finally 14 through 18 is the fourth paragraph, according to the editors. Nothing wrong with this, it's just an editorial decision that is made to help the reader understand what appears to be a subject alignment. I want the freedom, though, to be able to consider as I read the text that I may see things a little differently, or you may see them differently. And by putting things in a word processor, I can move things around to gain, in my judgment, and you have your own, greater clarity about what the passage says. So I'm going to expand out the margins to widen the text, because I'm going to want to make sure I've got room and not get bound by some just formatting restrictions. I usually go half-inch margins, and I'll do that in this case. So now for the text to read, and as I do that, I'll move the cursor and highlighting things that come to my mind. Starting in verse 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. There came a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. What I've discovered just on my first reading of these first 8 verses, and I pause here now because we're introduced to a name, John. What we've seen up until this moment are 3 references to Word in verse 1. We see 2 references to God in verse 1. And then we're introduced to the first pronoun in the book. He was in the beginning with a person, God. So now we know that the he is going to refer back to the Word 3 times. Doesn't tell us who the he is, although we'll know at the end of this section who it is. But right now, let the text say what it says. That now we talk about not only a person, God, Word, and a pronoun, we get all things, came into being through him. This him is going to be the he, which now we know is the Word. and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him, same person, was life. So all things came into being, life, and this light has a quality to it, was the light of men. Light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Now we see its impact. So we know it to be life, we know it to be light, we know that in contrast to darkness, it's superior to darkness. Then suddenly, onto the stage of this story comes a man sent from God, whose name was John. Different than the hymn, because he's going to come as a witness to testify about this light, so that all might believe through him. The all might believe goes back to men. Those men are people, as the passage appears to teach. He, being John, was not the light, but he came to testify. For the second time we see the verb, the infinitive, to testify about the light. What I'm going to do now is just separate by hitting enter to drop the text down, because there seems to be a division at the end of 8. At least in terms of my understanding of this insertion about John. The text continues, and we'll come back and break it even further. There was the true light which, coming into the world, enlightens every man. He, this true light, was in the world, and the world was made through him. This sounds very familiar to verse 3. All things came into being through him. This idea of the prepositional phrase, through him, is seen up here, through him. And yet now it's different than apart from him, this creation idea. Now it's about knowing. Although the world was made through him, and the world did not know him, he came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And now this word, mentioned earlier, is going to be described in terms of something else, that it became something, flesh. And this word dwelt among us, and we, now the person, first person, is seen twice, us and we. The writer includes himself in the story in a very personal way. You won't see this much in the rest of John's Gospel, but you do it here. Us and we saw his glory. Glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified about him and cried out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me." Now, by way of explanation, we see in verse 16, "For of his fullness," this word, "we have all received, and grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him." Surprisingly, on a gospel about Jesus Christ, the Apostle John waits until verse 17 to introduce his name. It appears that John is actually holding back the name Jesus to highlight other things about him that are important to get to the point of this revelation. Almost as if he's holding back after having dealt with eternity, that finally Jesus Christ steps onto the world stage in the incarnation, and now the story begins with the herald, John the Baptist. As noted here in verse 15, John testified about him and cried out, saying, now we get to hear John quoted. Not in terms of his assignment, as we saw earlier. There came a man sent from God in verse 3, whose name was John. He came as a witness. Now we get to see the actual text of the witness. This was he of whom I said. Evidently, John had said this before, and as we'll see in chapter 1, John will say this again. But for now, as I look at these 18 verses, I see something that, in my judgment, needs to be separated out. I feel that verses 16 through 18 are a conclusion to the opening 18 verses. So I'm going to separate by hitting enter this section down a bit and hold on to that and come back and look at it in light of the first 18 verses. Also see in verse 14 a subject change, that this light and the world's reaction to it is different than the Word becoming flesh and this beholding. He dwelt, we saw, he was testified about. So John's ministry is referenced a second time. So I see a parallel. This second time I see a parallel with verse 6 up here. So I'm going to drop this down even further, because it looks to me that 6 through 8 deals with John in relation to the light. And now 14 through 15, or 14 and 15, it's John in relationship to the incarnation. So these appear to parallel each other. Going back up to these first 5 verses, I want to look at them more closely and see that this appears to be, obviously, in the light of Genesis chapter 1, John begins his gospel in the same way. This is a title. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. It just ends abruptly as a statement. So I want to hold on to that, and I want to draw down now the instrumentality of the world coming through Jesus, or as we know because of the end of this particular section, verse 17. But right now, all things came into being through him, the Word, who was with God from the beginning. So now we know the instrumentality of creation is the Word, or more specifically now, we can say Jesus. And there's an effect of that instrumentality, that it was life and it was light. And it had an impact, that it shined in the darkness and was not overcome by the darkness. Going down now to look at this light again, having skipped over for just a moment John's testimony to the light, beginning now in this section in verse 9, there was the true light which coming into the world enlightens every man. This seems to me to be very similar to verse 1. I want to separate it out and keep it as a separate section for just a moment. Because in examining verses 10 through 13, noting he was in the world and the world was made through him, this prepositional phrase is parallel to what was said in verse 3, all things came into being through him. Verses 3 through 5 seems to me to be the notion that Jesus Christ is the means through which all are created, and that creation results in something, in a world of conflict, the light and the darkness, as we see in verse 5. If I take those elements and consider those in light of verses 10 through 13, I'll see very similar things. He was in the world and the world was made through him, the instrumentality. And yet the response. The world did not know him. They did not receive him. But as many as received, a different group, to them he gave the right to become children of God. So we see 2 distinctions, very similar to what we saw here at the beginning, that the light shines in the darkness did not comprehend. Now we see that not all received him, but some did. So distinction is drawn. I'm going to zoom out just a bit so we can see the passage in its completeness, a little small, but what I've done in dividing the text out this way is I've created what amounts to 7 distinct sections. Verses 1 and 2 are 1, and then the second one is 3 through 5. The third is 6 through 8. 9 is the fourth. The fifth, 10 through 13. The sixth is 14 and 15. And then finally, the seventh is 16, 17, and 18. If I look at this more closely, it appears to me that these first 3 begin with a thesis statement, deal with what, in this case, the Word did, and the effect that it had, and finally that it was testified to. What I discover is this is a section that I might look at now in just the beginning as the Word to light, as testified by John. So we're talking obviously about Jesus Christ, but the focus of the text is the movement from him being the Word to him being the light. Now that same theme, light, is now reintroduced in verse 9, the instrumentality of that light coming into the world and the reaction of the world to the light. And finally, the result is that you become a child of God. And it appears then that this second section is very similar to the first, that verses 9 through 15 are a second telling, or a second section very parallel to the first. The focus begins not with word to light, but picking up on the theme of light, it would move down to life. And once again, John testifies that this is he of whom I said, he comes after me as a higher rank, dealing with his eternal. So the focus here is that Jesus Christ, who's not introduced until verse 17, has already been described in this section and in this section, and twice been testified to demonstrate that it's true by John's testimony and his baptism that we'll see in the next section of chapter 1. So with this consideration of the text being this way, I want to now, once again, make some formatting changes. And moving down to the bottom of the page, I want to consider that this passage can be actually studied in one more tool, or the use of one more tool, through the use of a table to help show the highlights of what I believe go together in the passage. So, borrowing for just a moment some word processing tools, I'm going to insert a table that's going to include 3 columns and 5 rows. And if I do the 3 columns and the 5 rows and I insert this at the bottom, then what I'm going to try to establish is that the sections can be accounted for and draw the parallels to see if it holds up. So I'm going to take verses 1 and 2 in this particular section, and then following my earlier divisions, verses 3 through 5, and then finally for this particular column, 1 and then 6 through 8. Because I believe that this discussion about John here is paralleled by this discussion about John in verses 14 and 15, then I want to go ahead and make the comparison more quickly by having John 1:14 through 15 parallel. I'm going to move upward, following that 1:1 and 2 are parallel by 1:9. I'm going to go ahead now and complete my chart by taking 1:10 through 13. That leaves me then with 16 through 18 as a standalone. So I'm going to go ahead and take this particular 2 columns and merge it into one, because I want John chapter 1 verses 16 through 18 to stand, as I understand the text is, as a conclusion. So for the sake, once again, of alignment, I want everything to be centered. Let's make sure we get everything centered. So I'm looking for my cell alignment. Put everything in order. Now I can look at these things in what I consider to be, get this one done too. I can see that the first section, as I mentioned earlier, is word to light. And this section appears to be, once again, starting with light to life. I see life earlier. There's no doubt about that. It's within this. But we need to recognize, or at least my intention here, is that this notion of the incarnation is going to come all the way down to what is revealed through the incarnation. We have the fullness of God described here and it's been a received fullness. And it came not through the law, but it came through Jesus Christ. Why? Because he is the one who is going to reveal the Father, or in this case, exegete, or explain him. Every time that Jesus faces a conflict with the Jewish leaders, he will describe his relationship to his Father. This follows from verse 18. Now, if I come back and I recognize that the parallels mean that section 1 and 3 go together, 2 and 4 go together, and 3 and 5 go together, then I'm going to learn something by comparing them together. If I were to look at 1 and 3, in this case, verses 1 through and 2, and verse 9, what I discover, or at least as I consider it, the focus John is making here is the origin of Jesus is an eternal origin. So we just see that this idea of origin and enlighten. We see this in verse 9. I actually want to borrow those exact words. So enlighten. I want to keep the theme similar by drawing now that all things came into being through him in verse 3. Verse 10, he was in the world and the world was made through him. So I want to talk about means, that Jesus is the means through which all things have come into being. In other words, he is the agent of creation. So we see origin and then we see means. The second word that I want to capture is the idea of result or results. We see two things. There are those who didn't receive him, that sense of darkness, which is aligned with verse 5, and those who did receive him, the light, and they became children of God. So those are the results. And then finally, I want to look at the testimony of John. So I want to say John, in this regard, is bearing witness to an eternal light, but it's not just eternal light, it's also his flesh. So it's incarnate. So I want to make sure I say incarnate. And using, once again, the editorial formatting ideas, I want to just move and make an adjustment to smooth the chart out. And now I reach my conclusion, number 7. And the 7th is to recognize that we have Jesus Christ. And the focus now I can draw specifically, as I make my changes there, that Jesus Christ, coming back to verses 16 through 18, for of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace. The insertion of grace in abundance, it's over and over again. For the law was given through Moses. There's the contrast. Grace and truth were realized or experienced through Jesus Christ. So what we discovered in verse 17 is the Old Testament, but particularly the law, is the first half of the verse. The second half would be the realization of the incarnation and the New Testament, which is grace and truth. Further study will reveal that there was grace and truth in the Old Testament as well. But the law did not produce grace and truth in the way in which we're going to see John's Gospel do so. Be highlighted in several places, as we'll consider. And then finally, verse 18, no one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. Set this in contrast, if you will, that there are 4 names given to us in this particular 18 verse section. We see God, we see John, we see Moses, and then finally in verse 17 we're introduced to the name Jesus Christ. But the conclusion of all of that is that Jesus has come from the Father as the only begotten from his bosom, and is now, after being heralded by John the Baptist who testified about Jesus, now it is going to be Jesus who will testify and explain or exegete the Father. So Jesus has arrived, and in his incarnation, he will introduce to us that the law was not sufficient, but that he is complete sufficiency, and he is both grace and truth. And the way in which John's gospel is going to be written and told is to highlight in every scene and in every event how Jesus excels, or how his grace excels above the law or the natural world. So I want to highlight that as I title this last section, Jesus Christ, Grace, and I want to say exceptional for now, or in the case of the name of the study, Grace Excels, but it's Grace Exceptional. It's above all things, grace upon grace. Might appear to be odd to take a passage like this and to break it down like this, but I'm going to go ahead and now title the section just John 1, 1 through 18. And for the sake of formatting, once again, I'm going to put it in the middle. If I can remember how to put it in the middle. And in so doing, as I said, I'm not sure I can remember how to do it. Put it there. I'm going to grow the text up a bit and expand it, and I will have concluded my initial look at the passage to do more study by each one of these sections, which is worthy of an independent study itself. But I now have what I would consider to be the introduction to John's Gospel. And in some ways, because it is outlined in such order, and I'll draw more in the next lesson about why this is so important to consider in light of Genesis chapter 1, that I almost want to talk about this being a song or a hymn or some kind of introduction. It doesn't seem appropriate to call it preface. It doesn't seem even appropriate to call it introduction. It seems bigger than that. It seems more grand than that. It seems it came out of eternity. It's a sound, or it's a feeling. It evokes a particular idea. It seems like a song to me. Not sure that that's appropriate, but there are 7 elements as I've outlined, and that will be a theme throughout the Gospel of John. And it seems natural to me to consider this. So for now, I want to just title this 7 stanzas of eternal, I don't even like that, 7 stanzas of grace. And let that be the title for now. I may want to change it up and do something different later, but that's enough for me right now. And that concludes my introduction to Grace Excels Bible Study, John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18.